Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. My name is Jake Bernardus. Welcome again to Risking It All. It is beginning to look a lot like Christmas on that background, and also you'll notice the semi-wrapped presents in the back corner. I'm genuinely nervous today, so I've got three people on today, three wise men. We'll stay on the Christmas theme. We've got 12 questions for the 12 days of Christmas, and we'll split them into GRC present, GRC past, and GRC future for the Dickens fans that you'll notice that kind of quick reference. Between them, they have far more knowledge on this sector than I do. I've got some questions which I think may offend some of them, but we'll see how that goes. And if you have any questions, thoughts, concerns, comments, disagreements, please post them in the chat as we go. But we'll get going quickly so not to waste any time. So Simon, why don't we bring the three of them on? Hello to all three of you. I have two traditions on this podcast, an opening and a closing, which Jeff, who's been with me before, will know. The opening is you introduce yourself with what is your hobby, which may be obscure and weird, your hero, mine is Alexander Hamilton, if you've never listened to this before, and what is the biggest risk that you ever took? I know, Troy, it's ironic for someone that's British, but go figure. So go ahead. If we go David, Troy, Jeff in the order of my screen, hero, hobby, the biggest risk you ever took in life.
Dang. Why do I have to go first? We weren't preempted with these questions.
That's the point.
All right, so hero, hobby, and what was the last one?
The biggest risk you've ever taken.
The biggest risk I ever took? Oh, that's actually pretty easy. Okay.
Now you know what you're saying for that one. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. You said that one. All right, I'll start with hobby because it flows here. I love sushi. So a lot of guys have golf. I could talk like for hours and hours about sushi. And when we say sushi, I'm not talking about like American rolls here. I'm talking about sashimi, nigiri, like the good raw fish on a bed of rice. So if you guys ever want to talk about that, and sushi tourism, it's a big thing too. Done a number of trips to Japan, fortunate there. Hero, I'm going to keep the sushi theme here. Big fan of Nobu. Nobu, the founder of Nobu Restaurants, he's actually like a philanthropist as well. And I think he also was one of the early kind of Benihana like successors here in the U.S. that brought sushi to Americans too. So we're more cultured as a result of that. I don't know much about his personal life, so if he is like a terrible person, nobody like us. And then biggest risk.
Caveat now.
Yeah, I'm gonna cut that out. Like I don't want to get canceled. And then biggest risk. 2024 was a big year for me personally. Moved on from a very stable job into entrepreneurship. So from a professional standpoint, it's been a big risk, but very rewarding as well.
And who's the company you work for? What's the company that you own and run?
Yeah, formal company name, Mastermind Assurance. You can find us at mastermindassurance.com. We go by Mastermind for short. And we are a pure play ISO certification body. So all we do all day, every day, ISO audits.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Troy, on to you, sir.
I do want to say, how come we didn't get any Hanukkah love in the intro there, Jake? I
That's
mean,
true, actually.
Jewish. Yeah. Hanukkah starts on Christmas this year.
Good point. Really As a thought on my part, especially with the amount of Israelis that I work with, I'll apologize now in this public
Nah, I'm just giving you a hard time. That's what I do. Hobby. Memes. Memes is one of my hobbies.
Memes are your hobby, I'd agree.
I like to read. To read nonfiction. A lot of nonfiction. For example, I'm reading Ryan Holiday right now. So if you know who Ryan Holiday is, Right Thing Right Now, his latest book. That's what I'm reading right now. So those are the types of books I like to read. What was the other one? Risk?
Your hero.
My hero is probably LeBron James, since I'm a big Cleveland sports fan, and he finally brought a championship for me. And if you are American and follow sports, you know that Cleveland is terrible at everything all the time. So he's my hero, and I think he's a really good person. He handles everything really well in the spotlight, and yeah, he definitely since high school has been my hero.
I like it. The biggest risk you ever took?
The biggest risk was probably giving up a job as a auditor on partner track to go work for a startup.
Okay, yeah, we'll get to that at some point today, I'm sure.
That was probably my biggest risk. Yeah, that's my biggest risk.
Okay, thanks, mate. Who do you work for now? What do you do?
I work at Geels Norton now, and I am the director of ISO and SOC Assurance Services.
Perfect. Thank you. Jeff, to you lastly.
Perfect. I will keep it short and sweet so we can get to the real good stuff. So hero, it is definitely going to be all of the servicemen and women that fight for the country, especially this time of the year for all the holidays when they're away from their families. So appreciate that sacrifice. Hobby, golf. Got a lot of hobbies, but golf would be one of them. The goal of 2025 is to actually get good at it. We'll see if that happens. And risk, I have been skydiving several times, and the last time I went, I'm trying to think the exact altitude. I think we did 19,000 feet, which is above the, I guess, kind of legal limit in California without oxygen. So, and we did it without oxygen. So it was a risk because it wasn't easy to breathe, and it was a thrill. So that was the risk.
And what did you do, Jeff, for those who can't read your top?
Yep. So I'm a partner managing director at Shellman & Company, where we're one of the leading cybersecurity assessment firms.
Perfect. Thank you. And for anyone who wants to reach out to these guys, if you look at the event or any of the invites or posts that I've made about it, the reference for all of them and their companies are in there. So we will start with the state of GRC now. And we'll start with a nice, easy, non-controversial question. Is GRC now completely broken, pointless, and merely there for sales enablement? Who wants to start with that one? Because I've seen 3 LinkedIn posts that recently said that exact words.
David, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting term. Like it's broken. I think it's evolved for sure. And maybe we're going to get into a little bit of past here coming up, but so I won't dive too much in that. But I do think it's taken like a different flavor. I'll call it that. And what I mean by a different flavor really is just what people thought of a SOC 2 report 5 years ago has changed. And I really think what it stands for today is very much more table stakes in terms of baseline requirements that are needed for a service organization. Compared to 5 years ago, it may have been viewed more as a differentiator. And, if we think about like compliance as a differentiator and it could be revenue enablement, I think it had more of that kind of angle to it 5 years ago. It's when I say table stakes, it does unlock certain revenue for especially smaller businesses, startups today. But for midsize and enterprise, it's viewed as the baseline. You have it automatically almost if you service the North American market. If you don't have it, it's considered weird and possibly a detractor to business. And if you do have it, it's more or less a neutral point, like it's an expectation. So from the standpoint of the report itself, I will say the perception of the report has evolved. From the entire marketplace, which I'm sure we're going to get into that topic, I do think there are elements of it that might be quote unquote broken, that maybe that risk hasn't been exposed yet. But I think we are on a very interesting path that will either lead to kind of a newfound understanding for this marketplace, or there'll be a correction at some point as well. So I'll leave it at that without getting into too many other topics, which I'm sure are on the agenda.
No, thanks. Troy, Jeff, anything to add?
I mean, I'll say, I think David put it well. I mean, we can start off on agreeing for sure is that it's not, I don't think it's broken. I mean, I think it has evolved, it's changed. I think that the perception of it has changed. And I don't necessarily think that part of it is a bad thing. I mean, I think that, compliance needs to evolve. I think that the way that folks and organizations, build a compliance portfolio needs to evolve. There needs to be enhancements. There needs to be more technology used from a testing perspective. So I definitely don't think it's broken, but it's evolved. But I do think that there are aspects of it that need to be honed in and focused on and really appreciated again, which I think that's kind of where the market has been moving away from the core of the appreciation of the intent of a lot of the audits, but it's definitely not broken.
We'll come back to that appreciated intent. Troy, anything more on that one, or should I fire question 2 at you?
I guess real quick, I would just say I agree. I mean, GRC is not broken per se. I mean, if just looking at it from an internal perspective, right? A lot of companies have great GRC programs internally, right? I think when we're seeing broken, it's focusing on, external facing audits potentially, right? And the low quality that's, and that's what I think people are referring to. But I think what's broken is the mindset of GRC. Right now, people want like a piece of paper. They want this goal. They want to show leadership. Hey, we're compliant. We're certified, right? But that's not really what the intent of GRC is. It's to manage your risk, right? I mean, that's the whole idea. And you always have risk. It's not really about getting a piece of paper. Compliance should be the byproduct of a good security program. Compliance shouldn't necessarily drive your security program. And so I think what's broken is that compliance is kind of driving a lot of security programs. And that's good for initial smaller companies that need to start somewhere. But as you mature and grow, compliance should be a byproduct. It shouldn't necessarily be the driver, in my opinion. So
no, I think that's right. And I'll stick with you because you kind of poked this kind of thread. Well, I think that's happened is obviously it's becoming front and center and becoming accessible. We talk about the democratization, particularly of SOC 2, the fact that it's become available to anyone and everyone. And you'll find startups that are tiny, barely have like a product team, but yeah, their SOC 2's attested, or they'll put certified very frequently. I know you love that, Troy. But do you think this is a problem? Because I sometimes think now, is there a meaningfulness to, if you look at like a SOC 2 state, a reality that the security that compliance that underpins it in a Fortune 500 versus a tiny startup who have the same attestation and the same claims, have we kind of devalued and kind of are we starting to chip away and decay at what those things actually mean because we've over democratized the availability to anyone and everybody? To you first, Troy, since I was with you already.
Yeah, have we? Yes. Well, I think it's definitely. I know. I think David would probably agree with me on this, but or disagree with me on this. But I think that the value of SOC 2 and ISO 27001, PCI, you name it, I think the value or the perception of the value has definitely been downgraded over the last 5 years. I think the problem is that people, there's two problems. One is people who are getting their reports don't even understand what's going on in the audit or why they're getting it. They're told to get it till they get a sale. And then two, the people who are relying on these reports at these companies don't understand what they're looking at either. So you get like this like mixture of like whatever, right? And that's kind of the state we're in. It's like, what do we do with these things? Why are we doing it? Oh, they wanted it and we got that sale because of it. Okay, then we should do it. This is good, right? And that's kind of what it's turned into. So because of that, the value has become kind of what David said, is that it's to generate sales. I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. Like I agree, David. It's not bad that that's what's driving it. But when that's the only driver, I think that becomes a very transactional thing, right? Like we miss the point of what GRC is supposed to mean. And it just becomes, I need this report to win this work or to keep this client. So what do I have to do the baseline, to spend the least amount of money to keep this going? And that's what's kind of happening.
Yeah. David, go ahead, since you're going to disagree.
Yeah, I agree and disagree with Troy, as always. I do think the values change. I do agree on the transactional component. If you just tie your like driver for why you want to go get this certification or report just to like sales enablement only, you're going to end up missing the mark in terms of intent and like actually building compliance, like I'll say continuous compliance outside of like maybe what will be point in time for an auditor to look at. Where I disagree is I hope every organization worldwide that's a service organization seeks out something like SOC 2 or ISO 27001 in the short term. And the reason why is I view it more as a baseline. And if I articulate that a little bit differently, it's almost like a reporting standard, like the same way in the US where we have financial statements and we're familiar like GAAP reporting on how we are going to articulate what is net income. I view that very similarly for security. It's like, what is the minimum expectation if you are going to have customers who have end customers as a service organization in terms of what an acceptable use policy looks like, or what you need to do in terms of information backup or MFA or just end-to-end encryption if that's pertinent to you. And that's where I think there's a lot of value to those types of standards or compliance schemes. It gives an organization that might be starting from nothing, like the generic, like, here's what you should be thinking about in terms of initial policy set. Now, I have other thoughts when it comes to how you implement that initially. and whether or not you're using just like a policy library or something of the sort. But I will say, I think it's very good if you think of it like a reporting standard. It creates commonality, it creates comparables, it allows for you to assess a vendor, whether they are 5 people in terms of FTEs or 2 million people in terms of FTEs, in terms of determining whether or not like they have minimum security expected by whatever other standard regulation that exists out there in the marketplace.
Okay, thanks. Jeff, a slightly appended question on that kind of topic for you. When you talk about the democratization of SOC 2, you've obviously got down to the point where now it can be, I've seen audits for like less than 10 grand in SOC 2, which just seems absolutely mad. Like when you're trying to sell a service like you do, or Geels Norton do, or Mastermind do, which is aimed to be more of a premium, we'll get into premium versus budget assurance in a while, is that making it much harder to actually try and pitch the intent, the meaning, the real outcome, when people are just going, well, all I need is the certificate and that cost me 10 grand. So, Sheldon, I'm not giving you 50 grand.
Yes, I mean, no doubt. And it's a barrier to entry for sure. And I think that, we go back 10 plus years. I mean, Sheldon as a whole always been, positioning ourselves as a premium provider in the market. But we had a lot of success with startups because we were able to show our expertise, and we were able to, have very informed discussions and work with them to understand, you might be paying more than some other providers, but you're going to get more in return. You're going to get our perspective on how to, really build out a control set for scaling, because we were look at every one of our clients that we're not going to look at it a 1 year, assessment. We're looking, okay, where are you going to be as years 2, 3, 4, 5? And I think now that's part of the problem is that when we have those discussions and we show that value prop, the message isn't being received because there's so much noise in the marketplace. They're able to say, great, I appreciate what you're saying. Like it makes sense, but every dollar counts. We're going to maybe consider you when we get to years 3 and 4. So it's a big barrier to entry, and they're not able to actually, take that value and apply it to their business now, just because they have so much available and there's so much, I'll just say marketing jargon out there that says, hey, look, it's lessening the value of the product to just say, all you need to do is get something in hand. And I think David and Troy touched on earlier as well, is it's a sales, mechanism. And they're looking at it purely, if they don't have it in hand by tomorrow or by, a month from now, it's going to not allow them to close deals. And we respect that any startup or any business, they need to, you're only doing this on behalf of the business. So you need to allow it to generate sales, but you have to look at it in return that you need to give a quality product to give comfort to your customers. That's why you're doing it in the first place. So if you're giving them a bad product, you're kind of, shooting yourself in the foot a bit. So anyways, long answer short, I think that it is a huge barrier to entry, and it's something that, we're trying to get creative and come up with solutions of like, a tailored version of a SOC. ISO is more prescriptive, that there's not much you can do to tailor it to an organization. They can reduce their scope, but then that's where it kind of gets back on us as a firm is, okay, take our experience over the last 22 years of operation and try to apply that to every size of business to come up with something. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do.
Yeah, let me ask a follow-up question to you as well, and I'll go about the opposite direction. But so you talked about noise in the market in a very competitive space, and I think that I'm definitely I'm seeing that now. But I think the other side for me is like a crazily noisy regulatory landscape where like there's always something new, like, and they're always contradicting each other. If you look at like some of the stuff coming out of Europe in like NIS2 and the critical infrastructure is very different from the critical infrastructure regulations and discussions in the US. Look at the privacy laws interstate in the US are different. AI is completely all up in the air in terms of who sees what as the regulatory approach to this. It is an increased amount of regulations good? And does that mean that we're driving a conversation to try and improve and mature the baseline, as you talked about earlier, David, that kind of, you've got this is the minimum acceptable limit? Or is this just causing chaos and confusion because there's so many things that all disagree with each other at the same time?
Yeah, I'll say it's a bit of both. I would say I'm not a fan of over-regulation for really anything. I think that can kind of steer the ship sometimes in the wrong direction. And I think that if there's uniformity across the regulation, it can be a good thing. But when you have competing understandings and perception and definitions, that's where folks get confused. And ultimately, like anything, if it's overwhelming, you kind of say, okay, I'm going to push that aside and I'm going to focus on ultimately, the one task at hand, and they don't look at the bigger picture. And that's what we work with a lot of enterprise organizations, is to kind of maybe, we don't help them build it, but we help them, implement, or I guess assess it, is like a unified control framework. And that can lead to a lot of value for an organization that is trying to build a scalable environment to, appease NIST and, all these competing regulations that have slight variations. So you can see those variations a little bit easier from a tangible control perspective and not just from a legal jargon perspective.
Yeah, makes sense. Troy, David, who wants to go next on that one?
Yeah, keep me up here, because this is why ISO 27001 is so great. In all reality, it's a management system that's supposed to flex to additional controls that are applicable to your environment based on risk, and that risk could be a regulatory driver. If you look at some of these popular schemes international to the US, TSACs in Germany for automotive information security, if you go look at its control set, it's literally the same font as ISO 27001, the standard. I mean, they're literally building on top of it. Same thing with HDS for health data hosting out of France. So they're leveraging that management system approach, which is really just a fancy way of saying a governance program, and abiding by additional controls that have a different taxonomy of risks, whether it be automotive information security or PHI. So ultimately, I'll say, as an auditor, yeah, it increases our total addressable market, no doubt about it. Every time we get a new GDPR, EU AI Act, NIS2, DORA, great. There's people that are now focusing on this that might be in a different buyer segment, like legal departments in a company, and they're going to say, all right, what are we doing to get ahead of this, be proactive? From the standpoint of just compliance and certification, attestations, opinions, I'll say regulation really doesn't do much, because oftentimes there aren't certification mechanisms or equivalent. And if there are a certification mechanism, we just look at the GDPR, for example. GDPR certification exists, but it's just for such a narrow processing activity. You can't go get a management system wide certification for a GDPR. The closest thing you can get is one of these ISO standards, 27701. So I think it does create noise in potentially a negative way. And to Jeff's point, a unified or a common controls framework, I mean, that's the entire value proposition. Let me implement one control set of 100, 200 controls, depending on who I am. And then let me just show how these controls meet at a attribute level the underlying risk that we're trying to mitigate here. So I think that's a very mature mechanism for a service organization to implement. And it's very uncommon to see that type of foresight for a startup or small business who, again, is just viewing one of these reports as transactional at the moment because they're trying to unlock revenue and every dollar counts.
Yeah. Okay. Troy.
Well, hard to follow those two answers, but
you don't have to. If you have nothing to add, just
I'll just add that. Yeah, I'm not a fan of overregulation either, but I'm also not a fan of underregulation, like AI,
yeah.
Right? I mean, what's going to happen with AI, right? It can't be the Wild West, right? I mean, greed will take over, and money will will do things that people will do things for money that they shouldn't with AI if we don't regulate it. It's just human nature. So you can't have nothing, right? Especially when it comes to AI. I think CMMC will be an interesting experiment.
Yeah,
because that is kind of they built, and it's very confusing, and I can't even follow all the regulations for CMMC and what's happening. But apparently something big happened 2 days ago, but still it's not official yet. So this is the problem with the regulation, right? It's been 5 years since this thing came out, and 2 people on LinkedIn can tell you what's going on exactly, right? And people in the government can't even tell you, right? But once it is live and once it's fully going, which I think will be in the middle of 2025. It'll be an interesting experiment. And do I think that contractors should be given national defense information without any regulation in place and do whatever they want? I would think most Americans would say, no, that's bad. We should have something in place. So in that case, I think that's a good thing that they're doing that. Will it move the needle in terms of lowering risk, or will it just become a checkbox thing that doesn't actually lower risk? That remains to be seen, but there's 80,000 contractors that need to be certified. So if the market's going to be the market, then there's going to be providers out there doing the same thing that's happening in SOC 2 and ISO 27001, unfortunately. But the regulation's good. It's better than having nothing in that case. So something is better than nothing, but too much is not better than something. That's my
opinion. I think then, summarizing the current state, we don't think GRC is broken. We think it's evolved. In some ways good, in some ways bad. we think that it has become, as compliance, the driver for security in some respect, and therefore potentially over democratizing, as much as a startup SOC 2 might have a different meaning or different outcome to a Fortune 500 SOC 2, and there's a confusion around kind of what those really mean and what they represent. And that as we increase this regulatory landscape, we're seeing a hockey stick increase right now. It obviously drives better behavior, but also drives a lot of confusion, and it's hard to work out which is the one that's valuable. And I agree. The point is that if you find an underpinning management system and or unified controls approach, then you have a better way to just say, I don't really care what happens. I'll just pivot what I have to whatever they want to ask me next. I'll stick with you, Troy. So going to the kind of the ghost of GRC past, how did we get here? You use a phrase that I use a lot on LinkedIn, SOC in a box. For those who are listening, what does it mean? How did we get here, and why is it a problem?
What does it mean? It means that, well, here's what it means to me. To me, it means that you sign up for software and they tell you what to do and you follow it and you get your green check boxes, and an auditor comes in and just looks at the green check boxes and said you're good to go, and you get your clean report. That's what SOC in a box means to me.
Agreed.
Which I think is being scaled, yes, by the various startups. What was the other part of the question?
What's the problem? What does it mean?
What is the problem? What does it mean? It kind of goes back to the first question about lowering the quality and commoditizing, whatever the word is, SOC 2, and making it more transactional, I think, and lowering the bar and just devaluing it. I think there is a market for people to use those types of tools, but the tools can't be shelfware. They can't just be set it and forget it and hope that your GRC program or security program is good. You need somebody to own it, and they're being sold as SOC in a box. Click here, do this, and then you're good to go. You get your SOC 2 report. I mean, that's a great measure of success, I guess, but in the long term, I don't think that's really helping anybody. Short term, sure, you get your sale, you move on, and you can survive as a startup and win work. But if that's the mentality and that continues, then what is what are you building with these tools, right? I mean, it creates a false sense of security and compliance, I guess, also, which to me is a major thing that people might not realize is happening.
I guess to press the question further, what changed? You obviously, we used to work at Drata vendor space. I was an early customer and adopter of Drata, so I have no bad or negatives to say here, but both of us initially thought this was a great movement and are now both thinking that it's not. So what's changed in that approach, either in the way the customer is dealing with it or the way it's been presented or the way the auditors, or what's happened over time in the evolution that's made it go from being a good idea to a less good idea?
I think a couple things. One, I think VCs got greedy. So VC money got
shocking,
and marketing dollars went up and VC came in, right? That's one thing. And VC's not bad. I don't want to say it's all bad, but that's what happened, right? They had to show return. Yeah. They had to do whatever it takes to show return to investors. And two, you had audit firms popping up that were either associated with these providers or they associate with 3 or 4 of them, and that's how they built their revenue base, right? So when that's your source of revenue, you have to audit a certain way, in my opinion, and you have to have a price that's a certain price, in my opinion. In order to meet that price, you have to do things to lower your internal costs. How do you lower your internal costs as professional services? You either do less work, spend less time, lower your labor costs, outsource the work. I don't know. Those are the 2 big things that people do to lower their costs. And that's a problem, right? So if you're outsourcing to lower quality people, or you're spending less time on doing the audit because you feel you can rely on the technology, that kind of leads to not good. Right? I don't know what else to say.
No, I agree. For me personally, my opinion is that the tools didn't develop or evolve into a problem. What evolved as the issue was the relationship with the auditing firms. And what you obviously got as an auditing firm reliant on a certain company revenue, your natural inclination is, if I keep failing people on this system, am I going to lose that source of revenue? And at that point, you're being controlled by the vendor and you've lost independence. At that point, it becomes a really complex issue. So I'll go to you, Jeff, and then I'll come back to you, David, at the end with a slightly different phrase of the question. But Where does that leave you if you are an auditor who's reliant on a revenue stream from a software vendor for whom will dictate what your prices are? They'll provide you with a steady stream of work, but dictate your prices, which effectively means you're kind of a little handcuffed into kind of having to say, this is great, and pass every check. What does that mean for you as an auditor for an assurance provider? Like, what does that result in?
I mean, simply put, it's a conflict of interest. I mean, being a CPA firm, you have to, abide by a certain set of ethics that, allow you to make independent decisions where you're not connected to ultimately or paid for from the outcome. So I think that I know in reality that there are partnerships like that exist. I'm not here for it. I don't support it. I mean, I think that we really, that is kind of the centerpiece of what is commoditizing SOC 2 and some other assessments, is that they're selling these GRC platforms as a package that, like, you buy the platform and you get an audit. And they really need to be two completely independent pieces. I mean, of course, there can be partnerships. I mean, Shellman has partnerships. Everybody's got partnerships. I mean, that's business. But it's how you approach those partnerships is what is key. And I think, you need to, as the best interest of our customers that are going to be using the GRC platform, getting an audit, it's in their best interest to have those completely separated. Again, knowing that there are partnerships, of course, but there really should not be any interconnectivity, because that's where, where do you draw the line, and where do you see that line? And I think that line evolves. I mean, I think it's moved in the last year and a half. I mean, I think that it just continues to get tougher and tougher to have that independence. And I think a good audit firm, a respectable one that is out there trying to, produce really strong, the core of what SOC 2 and ISO is. They're not making those partnerships. They're really wanting to have those informed discussions and say, great, you're using this tool, no problem at all. We respect that, but we want to approach it the way that we're comfortable, that our ethical boundaries stand. And when you try to sell as a bundle, I think you lose that.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I agree. I want to come out of any kind of vendor bias and come back from that. So Dave, a slightly different phrase to question. You've also got two different models there in terms of the assurance and the provider themselves, from kind of what is a budget assurance provider will bring the cost down to make the SOC in a box kind of costings work, versus a premium assurance says, this is our price because this is what we're providing. I don't really care if they can do it for a quarter of the price. I suppose two parts of that question is, one is, what are you getting and what's the value of doing a more premium assurance offering? And the second part, we talked about how the certification and attestation are the same. So how do buyers or customers get smarter in trying to understand where real assurance work and real insights been provided versus where boxes have just been ticked?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it goes back to this conflict of interest that Jeff was talking about too. And I think it can show itself in different forms. It's not always just, do I have like a sketchy partnership with a compliance platform that's feeding me leads, and maybe there's referral fees, kickbacks, commissions, or some other form of compensation that's under the covers there, and it's not public to the buyer. But in what you're kind of describing, which is just differences in budgets for the same work stream for presumably the same or equally weighted deliverable due to accreditation or just whatever the license looks like behind the deliverable. I think what it comes down to, and this is my opinion and my experience, but whenever in ISO, there's a concept called transfer audits. So essentially, when you have an incumbent organization that is certified organization A, and certified organization A wants to transfer that certificate to a new certification body, we get to see kind of under the covers of like, what was the prior year audit report look like? What was the extent of the testing? It's not just the certificate deliverable we're looking at. It's part of that transfer review. And I'll tell you, it's depth of testing. It's amazing, really, kind of what some certification bodies can gain reasonable assurance over with the amount of testing they're documenting here. Now, that's a gray area within the ISO standards, for example, and I know it's a gray area with SOC reporting as well. It's like, at what point do you have this concept of reasonable assurance when you're testing a given criteria or control area? And that is always kind of comes down to what they call auditor judgment, which is just fancy terms for saying, like, it depends. It depends on what you're looking at. It depends on how comfortable that auditor can get over your environment. Maybe there's some continuity there, which has created that judgment. or maybe there's like other sort of like reliance type testing going on where they are familiar with the system providing the data and they can get comfort over like, a test of one versus a sample of a total population. With that being said, it all comes down to budget. Budget translates into level of effort because you're literally dividing that by number of hours or your bill rate to determine number of hours you have for an engagement. And I'll tell you what the trend was originally, like if we could just go back 5 years ago, it was how quickly can I like audit these controls? Then that turned into, okay, I'm going to do this quickly, but I'm now going to use a junior resource, meaning somebody whose bill rate hasn't escalated yet to like what you see for like a manager or partner level, and maybe even our like what we call university or campus hires. So 1 or 2 years of experience. And then that shifted to offshoring. And we said, all right, where can we go find the cheapest labor in the world to do this on a per hour basis? And now what we're seeing is like the use of AI agents to do this. So it's not even a human anymore. It's just automation here that's performing automatic tests. And so at some point you start losing that reasonable assurance element because you either don't have a human at all making decisions on this, or that human is what we would call incompetent. And that's not to be like a slur or like negative connotation, but it's like you lack experience and skill. And so I think that's where it comes down with these firms. Like, yes, theoretically, they can produce an equally weighted deliverable. For example, an accredited ISO 27001 certification, a SOC 2 examination report that has no exceptions listed on it, yet they are part of the AICPA peer review program, whatever that weight still has. It comes down to ultimately, will the end user, the reader of these reports, accept it? And if they accept it, then maybe there isn't any issue here. But the way that I was brought up in this industry, and I have the traditional Big Four background, you have to go through traditional reasonable assurance type tests. And that doesn't just mean look at the surface of the control and the evidence you're receiving, but also going behind and seeing what systems are populating that data. And I just don't know how you can do it for, doing ISO 27001 certification for $4,000. There's just too many hours you need there in order to test the 93 Annex A controls efficiently, even from the most broad sampling requirements that you could possibly apply to that.
Yeah, I agree. And one point you made about the non-exceptions is a bit of bugbear of mine. I'm kind of an advocate of true transparency. I think we should show trust centers, pen test reports, compliance reports, warts and all, and talk about how the fact no one is perfect. But it's hard when you have tiny startups who have exceptionalist SOC reports and perfect ISOs, and where like people are like, well, why is yours not that? I'm like, because I let someone actually look at my reality. Like we talked about real things. Question to each of you is a yes, no question. So I'm obviously part of a company that works in GRC automation anecdotes. There's hyperproof like us. Troy, you came from Drada. Drada and Banter unarguably changed the game in terms of compliance automation by connecting applications through a technology stack to give real-time or near real-time attestation to whether a control was working or not in a technical and logical sense. That's changed auditing and made all these conversations that we're having today. David first, then Troy, then Jeff. Is that positive? Has compliance automation made things better? Yes or no?
Without any justification? Yes.
No justification.
Made it better.
Okay. Troy?
Made it. That's an interesting question. Has it made it better? No. I'm going to say no.
Okay. Interesting. Jeff?
It's tough to say yes or no. I mean, if I was going to say yes, it was going to have a massive asterisk next to it. So I'm gonna double down with Troy and say no.
Interesting. All right, I like it. I'm going to give no context whatsoever. I want to just leave it out there and see what people thought who've had large parts of this movement. Summarizing, I suppose, how did we get here? I think we're fairly agreed that we've got to a place of what we call SOC in a box. For those who want to understand that, is basically ticking boxes to get your SOC report through vendors. That software, and I agree, Troy, always fantastic intentions that create startups, and then VCs start to drive them into places that usually mean they have to do things that they didn't necessarily want to do ideologically. And you get to a point where you've got these auditors who are controlled by and or compensated by software vendors and therefore have a bias, and there's conflict of interest, Jeff, as you pointed out, which I entirely agree with. You get this difficult then, David, and I like your point of, if no one really cares, is there a difference between premium and budget? It's a good question, because I teach a lot of people who say, no, there isn't a difference. I just need the cert, right? And that shows this kind of sales-focused view of compliance versus this security focus, which you said, Troy, right? That compliance is a byproduct of security. not the opposite way around, which people often see the other way around. So I guess the future of GRC is the last point that goes to the future. So I've seen this a few times. I know you're all auditors, so I'm curious to see how aggressive you respond. But David, you pointed out the use of AI, and we also talked about automation of controls in terms of multiple vendors who do this. Are we looking at a future where there's no auditors? Are we looking at a future where we connect straight from tech stack to platform to certifying body, and your effective role right now doesn't exist in its current form? Is that a fair or ridiculous statement, David?
That was ridiculous. I'm not going to run there. But no, there's always going to be human decision-making elements that are required, and that's like a core tenet of AI governance. And so if AI is that future, and we're saying automation is going to be increased in its utilization, then it's going to be more competent humans that are needed in order to validate those systems and the output of those systems. But you asked the second question there. Am I okay to answer the future of GRC, or are we waiting on that?
No, go ahead.
Okay. I think you almost kind of touched on it, but I think it's these very public like trust centers, and trust centers need to evolve too. The current trust centers, like 9 times out of 10, it's a red light, green light situation. And like, let me show you my certificate deliverable or equivalent.
Yeah.
That's fine. That's definitely the starting place for where I think trust centers needed to be. But in all reality, you should be able to self-service the actual test that's going on.
David, you're preaching to the choir. I've literally been trying to convince our product team that we should do this, but none of our customers think it's a good idea. I'm like, let's have every control live in the trust center so they can actually see what's happening now and real time and ask questions.
You should be able to, and you should be able to do it through continuous monitoring as well, which there's elements of ConMon, continuous monitoring, that you'll find in other schemes today. But continuous monitoring is very, very early in terms of adoption. We talk about type 2 periods, which there's an element of that that's applicable to ISO. It's really more of a point in time assessment though. But for SOC reporting, SOC 2 type 2, everyone's familiar with, typically a 12-month period. And that's saying, I'm going to go test once a year that the controls were in place and working for that period of time. We should be able to run that same test as, self-service end users of the service organization in real time as well. Now, there's obviously an element of privacy and confidentiality that will need to be embedded into this type of, future state. But I do think trust centers have a long way to go in terms of truly providing trust at, a landing page. So I'm excited to see that happen, because I think that's going to create a lot more transparency and authenticity behind what is actually being provided as part of that third-party assurance.
Troy, I'm going to ask you a question based on what David said and continue down my slightly antagonistic theme. He just basically described a live trust center where you can query controls yourself and effectively run the test as and when you want to. Doesn't that mean at that point I don't need you guys to provide reasonable assurance because I can get it myself from the trust center?
Yes.
So is that the death of auditing?
Well, I don't think that. I don't think what I think the death of auditing will be is that the market loses trust in the audit ecosystem more than anything else.
Is that happening now because of the budget assurance, stock in a box type stuff we talked about? Do you think that's already happening?
I do see. I think there have no, because there's no viable alternative right now.
Okay.
Like maybe what you're saying, like being able to self-service and do it yourself, could be the future, and we're probably a long way away from that. But that could be a viable alternative. But I think that I don't think people haven't lost trust because they can't, if that makes sense. Like they're they have nothing else to rely on, and so like you have to rely on a SOC 2 report or an ISO or a questionnaire or whatever other due diligence you're performing. So right now, no, but in 5 years, if the big players decide we don't even want your SOC 2 report, we're going to do our own thing and have our own agent on your systems that tests the controls we want to see. Forget about this SOC 2 and ISO and everything else. We have our own assurance. And if you want to work with us, you need this agent installed, and we're going to monitor and get alerted if something's out of compliance. And we're going to be like, what's going on here? Hey, why is this control failing? I think the bigger players are starting to think of that, to be honest. So if that starts happening, then yeah, why do I need a SOC 2 report if I can do my own assurance on my suppliers?
It's an interesting concept. If everyone starts installing agents on all of your endpoints and/or cloud infrastructure, what also the compute headache would be there, and how that would actually form a commercial. I mean, there's an interesting whole different line to go down there. Jeff, slightly twisted, different question. I guess one thing that I'm always conscious of is that passing an audit is a bit of a dance. Like, people come, you kind of pre-prepared, you know what they're going to ask you, you kind of know what the control is going to be, you've kind of phrased and kind of created that moment in time. One thing I've been talking a lot recently at dinner events about is the idea of compliance red teaming. That like audit shouldn't be pre-planned or pre-discussed. That, like, you shouldn't even know they're happening. They're almost to David's point that someone can access either remotely or whatever it is to kind of test your controls and assess your position based on you not being able to prepare and know what's going to happen. What do you think? Am I onto something? Is this a marketable idea, or is this an awful thought?
Yeah, definitely not an awful thought. I think that the tricky piece with that is, I mean, really how practical it is. I mean, and what the end goal is. I mean, if we're just looking at the core, I mean, most of the time we've been talking about SOC and ISO, and I think David and Troy both touched on this part of it, is that it's a reasonable assurance assessment. I mean, the goal isn't to get absolute assurance. So the red teaming approach, I mean, that just, adds another layer of complexity, formalization that you're gearing towards absolute assurance there. And then it's ultimately, where does that risk, lie? So I think that there could be something there. And I think red teaming is very valuable. Obviously it's very specific to right now, like, federal type assessments, whether it's FedRAMP or, state ramp, et cetera, but in just general pen testing and invest security practices. But when you come to organization, it's just, I don't find that to be scalable or appropriate for all organizations out there. We still have to look at and respect that there's going to be, versions A, B, and C of every company at different stage of their growth. And I think that maybe there could be some formalization around what types and size of companies need to go through what version of a SOC or ISO. I mean, just throwing that out there, never really thought that much through it. But I mean, if you're going to add some complexity to it, maybe breaking it down from that perspective, because I don't think that you could or should do that type of approach for all organizations. But yeah, I mean, I think, one thing I did want to touch on, just because it's kind of in the same vein of the question before, but there just needs to be simply more attention to who's auditing your systems and who's producing the report. And there needs to be more transparency on, I know there is the AICPA, there's the peer review process, and people are supposed to publicly, display the results. Not all do, but I do think that some bit of a format of like a FedRAMP marketplace could be really valuable, where, assessors can show who they're assessing and some high level results. So it's kind of a hybrid mode of some bit of a trust center from an audit, an auditor, the company perspective, as well as that kind of a marketplace point of view, where there could be some, not grading or whatnot, but there could just be more transparency from that perspective. I think could add a little bit more trust to the external marketplace of who's performing the assessment.
There's two things said there that I really like. One is this idea of like a tiered SOC 2, so you could actually have some differentiation between the one that a startup gets versus the one that a Fortune gets. What the difference actually is inside of that. Maybe it's deeper or more granular testing or whatever else it might be. And the second is the idea of compare and contrast between auditors, almost like a shop approach, which I like. I think I've told the story to people before that I moved off of Sherman once and went to a very much cheaper provider, our own name, who gave me a outsourced Russian auditor who spoke questionable English. I while I was on a vacation in the Maldives on a beach, I spent about an hour arguing about the requirement for time sync protocol in AWS and whether that was really a thing in 2024. And then about key rotation, everything else it could possibly be, because he was going, as David, as you all know, word for word through the ISO standards. And regardless of whether I explained this wasn't relevant, he was insistent that it was. So another kind of quick fire question with no justification. We talked about what we use as a control framework to underpin all these change of regulations. If you're going to pick one, what would it be? David, we'll go to you first.
Oh, geez, wonder what I'm going to say. Geez, it's got to be a management system standard. So anyone who doesn't say that, it's going to be wrong. ISO 27001. There you go.
Okay, Troy.
What was the question exactly? What's the best
got to pick
standard?
one control framework or standard to kind of rule them all. You've got to pick one to base off of what you're going to pick. There was a meme right there for you with a one control framework to rule them all.
Yeah, I guess if I was running a GRC program and I was trying to build one at a company, I think I would probably start with NIST CSF.
Yeah, it's fair. Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, I if Troy he kind of stole that answer because I help oversee our NIST-CSF practice at Shellman, and I think that is now, especially with 2.0, a very, well, you said not to expand on the answer, just to give it, but I'll just to support that. I will say that it is now that all verticals, different industries, size, it applies. So I think that's a perfect one to start from for a foundation. But I think David is I support that one as well. Definitely, I think a management standard is very appropriate.
Okay.
Yeah, the best is probably using this CSF with your ISO 27001 certification, right, David?
There you go. Look at
they do math nicely now.
To summarize that in the future, we do not think that auditing is going to die, and unless David maybe talked himself out of his own role by suggesting a trust center, which you could attest and assess yourself. But I think that trying to get to a point where assurance is more available to external parties in a way that's more consumable than it currently is. And I always think that we should also have to package compliance into some kind of SBOM type thing. For those who don't always listen, an SBOM is a software bill of materials, and it shows how your code is built. But we should be able to make some kind of compliance version of that shows how it was right now, to be able to ship that to someone who can ingest and do something with it. And I think we're starting to get there in some regulatory talk about how we could get to that point in the future. I'm conscious of time. I've got many more questions. Go on.
I would just say, I don't think auditing won't die. It's just who or what is doing the auditing will change. The concept of auditing will never go away, because
that trust center as a service, it's still a front end. Someone's got to audit whether or not what those tests are saying and presenting to the end users.
That's what I was going to add in. There's still got to be some element of trust from independent third party validation that is even working. So you can never remove the human element, at least not in our lifetime, I hope.
I'm glad you've all reassured yourself of your validity in the future. Always good to hear.
I want to remove some of the humans from it, I think. We'll leave it at that.
One last traditional. Anything else that any of you want to add before I close with my final tradition on the podcast?
We started touching on this, and I always think it's a spicy topic, but it's just talking about these relationships with auditors with GRC platforms. I'll tell you, they have gotten very smart in terms of how they compensate each other. You will not find referral fees, kickbacks, commissions at this point. Everyone knows that's a no-no. So what you're seeing now in turn is how do I get featured in your auditor directory, and can I pay a marketing fee for that? There are other ways to show that there are conflicts of interest here. So I've seen similar types of panels where we bring, X, VP, a partner or whatever, over one of these platforms, and they talk very, very passionately about how they want to combat this conflict of interest issue that's happening here. But there are pressures that are there. The VC money is definitely part of that. But I'd even say we started getting into this topic as well. But who controls the customer top of funnel? If you are a startup and you're looking for ISO or SOC for the first time, you're going to go Google search it. And when you Google search it, the first thing that's going to pop up through paid AdWords is one of these platforms who are spending, we've done analysis on this, over $1 million a month US just on AdWords and AdWords spend, because they are going to get that first touch point with that prospect and be able to tell them exactly how this entire process is going to happen all the way down to the finish line. And I think that is the noise in the marketplace that is not good for the industry. I said overall compliance automations are good, and you didn't let me justify that. I'll still hold that for later. But in all reality, if the top of funnel is being controlled by these salespeople working for these platforms with a very clear incentive, and they do not have to abide by standards, conflict of interest, or impartiality requirements in the case of certification bodies, then they are going to shape what is considered normal. And that is where our root issue lies, is the top of funnel sales process at the moment.
No, I agree with you. I've got to a point where I obviously am an advocate of automation and compliance because it's what my job is, but I think you should be arming auditors with a better way to do their work rather than trying to get in bed with the auditors per se and dominate and control that space. It should be a completely separate relationship, at which point you might refer and say, these auditors are great. I get asked all the time who are good auditors, and I refer the ones I think are good. And I'm sure the reverse happens when people ask auditors and say, what's a good platform for me to use? And I hope that they give multiple options. Because there isn't a contractual commercial relationship in place, right? So I totally agree with you. I think it is a hot topic. We can definitely handle it on a future podcast. I think it can take an hour in itself on kind of where we've got to in that space. So yeah, happy to hold that one in the future, see what happens. Troy, Jeff, any final thoughts you want to throw in before I ask you one question?
Final thought is, I think there is a mindset from some of the automation platforms that there are certain auditors out there that don't like to don't like the disruption and don't like using technology and feel threatened by it. I don't think that's necessarily the case at all. There are a lot of us who are in SOC 2 obviously love technology. We audit technology companies, so we're definitely not against technology. We just want it done the right way, and we just want more transparency. That's really what we're asking for. And we want to be able to audit without undue influence from third parties. And so if we have questions, it doesn't mean we're against technology. It just means we're trying to do our job. And we want to use technology to make our lives easier. So I'll leave it at that.
No, I agree. The conflict, like I say, it comes back to the bias and the conflict of interest and being able to make your opinions and decisions as you want to and as you should be able to, that they're not influenced by the vendor who is providing you that data or technology that allows you to kind of get the report built, but that you can then still say, but this doesn't make sense and I don't like this, but I think fear of the fact that might affect your revenue stream. Totally agree. Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, just to clarify with the automation side of that, I mean, I think that was well said. I mean, there are a lot of audit firms, Shellman certainly towards the top, that have limited, I guess, exposure and partnerships with the GRC firms, but we don't have any negative bias against it. It's just we want to make sure that when a client is using that tool, that it's a collective, collaborative discussion of how it's going to be used, how you're still going to get to that endpoint and get a quality report without skipping anything from point A to Z. So I think that's what's key. It's and then ultimately, to Troy's point, a lot of auditors get a bad rap. It's like we're not willing to use the tool, we're not able to use the tool, and that's not it at all. It's just that there needs to be a plan, and it can't be reactive. It's got to be a very proactive plan, not a reactive plan. But the last thing kind of on the automation side is, I mean, myself, Shellman, all quality auditors, they're not going to shy away from automation. Automation and building efficiencies is a great thing. I mean, I think that there are a lot of ways to make audits more efficient, and it doesn't need to impact and lessen the quality. It's just looking at that from a holistic view of how can you make things more efficient and effective, while increasing quality or at least maintaining quality. It's possible. So I think that needs to be the continued focus.
Yeah, definitely. I think technology should obviously enable you to do your jobs better and not inhibit it. And I think a lot of it also relies on us, and I can count ourselves as part of that as the vendors, to actually educate auditors on how to leverage the platform technology we do, how that will enhance your experience versus actually inhibit it. I think often we sell to the customer and forget that actually the auditor is part of that customer chain, and then we don't facilitate and enable them to understand why this is beneficial to them, and we're kind of missing that step. And then we naturally create this kind of like conflict that you see where it's like us versus them, which is nonsense, because in the end, our entire business model is built on enabling people in the insurance world to do their work more effectively, and not the opposite. I always close with a question from the previous guest. That's I think I stole off of the Diary of the CEO podcast. If anyone's watched that, Stephen Bartlett, always great, interesting guest. And the former guest that I had gave me this question, very topical of Christmas. What is the one thing you wanted as a child as a present, but did not appear under the tree? So for me, I once wanted a Micro Machines City. Desperately wanted. If anyone's old enough to also remember Micro Machines, and it did not appear or manifest itself under my tree, and I was heartbroken. And I think it's probably the year that I started to question everything about my beliefs. David, you were nodding, so I'm going to put you straight on the spot straight away.
I wanted a motorized or like electric scooter. Those were really popular back in the day. And I got the manual one, and ended up having an accident actually when I was like 10 or 12 years old. And I have two fake front teeth now because I like fell into a concrete sewer drain and busted my front teeth out on that manual scooter.
Maybe the manual one saved the rest of your face though. Had it been electric, you might have been faster and done even further damage.
It's possible. You're very right.
Troy, what about you?
Well, I didn't have a tree, remember?
Oh, of course. I've ruined. What is one present you wanted that you didn't get?
I don't even know. Oh, you're putting me on the spot. I don't remember. I got everything I wanted, so thank you, Mom and Dad. We'll leave it at that.
What a privileged life you've led, Jeff.
Wow, this is going to take me back on some of my sore spots back in the day. What trauma did I have for gifts that I didn't get? I would say there was a very specific BMX bike that I wanted that was completely unreasonable and unrealistic for a kid to get, but I really wanted it. And my parents said, well, now you need to get a job and then you'll get it. So I didn't get it under the tree. I had to work for it.
Well, that's the lesson that you got under the tree. And look where it's got
So
you.
that was a gift. That was the gift to keep on giving.
And look where it's got you. Listen, thank you, gentlemen. It's been an absolute pleasure. If the community wants to hear more from any of these people, let me know, and we'll have them back on individually and discuss some more pertinent and some confrontational topics. But I appreciate the time you've given to us. Happy Christmas, holidays, and Hanukkah to all of you, and to all those listening as well. So thank you very much, and we'll call it a wrap there. So it's bye from me and bye from everybody else.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.